So obviously you've been pretty transparent about your like mental health journey, and this is probably the big part of the conversation I want to talk to. Because I look at you, you sit in front of me, NRL player, solid dude, big Islander. Everyone thinks you got your shit together. What's it been like going through this transition? And like, let's talk from like start to where you are right now. Like, when did you first notice signs that you were feeling a little bit down?
Yeah, sort of when COVID hit, like obviously everyone had those, like you weren't allowed to go anywhere for a bit, and when COVID first came, so I remember the game. I remember what it was. It was round 1 or 2 against South Sydney. My mum, my dad, and my grandma came over, and they had planned like a 2 week stay, and then Jacinda Ardern had said, like by 12 o'clock this day, you can't come into the country. So it was like 2 days after the game or a day after the game, and they had to get a
Flight home.
flight home straight away. So then sort of they locked their borders, and then we sort of shut down, and then I was by myself. Like I lived by myself, and it was sort of a time where you're there just like sitting in there in your own thoughts and what's going to happen now. And I just sort of realized that I was a very anxious person. I felt things got to me, and I dwelled on them for a lot longer than I thought. And it was tough, because you do think you have it all like wrapped up and you're all good and everything's sweet, but when one hits you, you sort of get into this mood and you're like, far out, like I can't get out of this. Like what's going to happen?
What's this like smallest thing that you'd sort of start to dwell over? Because a lot of people might think it's performances, but is there like anything that was in your day-to-day life that would start to stress you out?
Just the fact of me being by myself. Like I sort of envied the boys in the team that had families, and sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I sort of envied the boys that had families and people to go home to, because you could go to training and see your friends, and you go home and see your family, your loved ones. And for me, it was just going home and just sitting there. Like I would dread going home, to be honest. Like I would sit in the car in the garage for like 20-30 minutes just sitting there scrolling on my phone, because I didn't want to go inside, because I felt like I was still out. So yeah, just going home was a tough task for me. Like it was daunting, and it was home where is usually the safe space for you, and then where you feel safe and comfortable. It didn't really feel like home. It felt like just a place for me to sleep, and it was tough. Like I know comparing hardships is never the way to go, and you always think like someone out there has got it harder for me, but yeah, it was tough for me. So yeah.
And that's a big thing, because a lot of people, like everyone always seems to compare, like say football, like you lose a game and like, oh, these guys are digging holes, like that's always the comparison that people go through. That's a good point you bring up about like not comparing, like it's because I do it as well. Like there's times I'll have conversations with my partner and she'll say something and then I'll be like, oh, that's like me, like I've gone through this. Like everyone's hardest thing that they've gone through is the hardest thing that they've gone through.
It's like you got a battle of who's going through the hardest stuff, like if it's like, it might not be like things, you say something about someone and it might not be offensive to them, but you never know who's listening in. Like it could be offensive to them, it could be offensive to someone else. And like when you compare things, it's just, there's no real winner. Like what are you trying to win there? Like
who's sadder?
Like why can't you try and like,
you don't want to win that comp?
No, you don't. You want to sort of have the capacity to help them if they're feeling down and have them help you. Like there's no point going back and forth of who's had it hardest, like, because there's no winners there. It's all both losers.
So when you like over this past couple of years start to like look at yourself and sort of unpack things, do you look back at your childhood? Was there anything traumatic that happened in your childhood?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in therapy. I've been seeing this guy, a therapist, for the last maybe 2 months now, every sort of 2 weeks, and it's been the best thing. You never realize how like much stuff has been buried into you from such a young age, like a childhood, and then how it actually affects you as an adult. Like, I've unpacked things with him that from a child that might have framed me to who I am today, and how I handle sort of things. Like, obviously, he taught me that two things can coincide. You can love your parents and everything, but you can also be upset with what they did to you as a child. And being an Islander, from an Islander father who's very strict and disciplined, and his sort of, and you sort of get the hiding every now and then, and the reason for it was never explained. It was just, son, like, because I love you. I do this because I love you. And like, so then you sort of associate love and violence, and it's like, if that's how love is, what's hate? Like, you sort of like, how bad is hate if I'm getting a hiding because I'm loved, like, and you look back on it like, did you deserve some of the hidings? I think there was better ways to handle it, of course. But I respect my dad a lot, and I love my dad. But I do think, looking back on my childhood now, there was definitely things that could have been handled differently. But yeah, it was you never realize until you've grown out of it and you've moved on and you've become an adult and you start talking about it, that things from back then have an effect on the adult that you are today.
Do you think about, is there an element of sympathy towards him because potentially that's how he was brought up?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Like I spoke to my mum when we went back for round one. I got the chance to have lunch with my mum, and I spoke to her and I was like, obviously me being the eldest, do you think I caught the brunt of how dad grew up? And she was like, 100% you did. There were so many times that me and your dad had arguments about the way he handled you, and we sort of got into verbal altercations, and hearing that was like, it sort of, I did sympathize with my dad because, especially him, like his generation, they never saw vulnerability as strength or tears as strength. They just saw it as weakness, and they saw like emotions as weakness, and I doubt he ever saw his uncles or elder cousins or father cry more than twice, or unless it was at a family funeral or something like that, And like, I can recall how many times I saw my dad cry. It was like maybe 3 or 4.
Bro, I'm same boat. I remember my dad crying when I was a kid, like maybe twice.
Yeah. And you're never around it, so then you grow up and you're like, nah, this is why it's such an important topic now, that men's mental health. Like, people got to realize that you're not diminishing a masculinity, you're just opening up an avenue for you to alleviate the stress, other than going out and having a drink or
prescription drugs
or punching holes in the walls. Like, it's they're extreme avenues, but there's also ways that, like talking to someone, like saying 2 words, writing it in a book, your thoughts that are going on in your head, or going for a walk or something, like, I'm still working on that myself. I feel like I get a bit heated and I project my anger out the wrong way. And I'm still working on that with my therapist and trying to get myself to a point where I can sort of just take 5 minutes by myself and come back and refresh and talk with my partner more calm and clear. But I do look at my dad and I think, like, if you only did what you knew.
Yeah, for sure. But I can relate to the story like so much, because my dad like was my coach. He was like tough. I never got like hidings or anything, but like it was an option, you know what I mean? But like when I got to about 2021, I was over in England and things weren't going my way and I couldn't like handle the pressure, and I like dived into like Valium and prescription drugs, and I could get access to them like straight away, and Xanax, and I used to have them all the time. And I remember like even a couple of weeks ago, like a lot of things are changing in my life at the moment, and I remember I had this one random thought. I was like, fuck, I just love a Valium right now, so I could get like 12 hours sleep. So it's interesting you sort of bring that up, because I used to use it as a coping mechanism for me to get by, or use alcohol as a coping mechanism to get by, instead of just opening up or like being sad. And I remember I cried maybe about 2 or 3 times in my football career. And I remember I snapped my Achilles, and it was a week after I played a test match. I went back to reserve grade because I made it from, which is a crazy story, and I snapped it in the first minute. And I was like, bro, I was so down. And I remember I went in and he's like, oh, you snapped your Achilles, your season's over. And I just started like crying, and I cried for like 5 minutes, and then I like come out and I like wiped my tears, and I was like, went back to the sideline. I was like, oh, I have to be a good teammate here, and like, I don't want anyone to know that I'm like, I was crying or I'm a sook, and I was just sitting there like, down, bro. And then I got my surgery and I was lying in bed for like a day, bro. I couldn't stop crying. I remember I felt better after.
It's crazy how like good you feel after. It's just like all the built up emotions like you would have been feeling then. You would have been feeling like hard done by. You would have been feeling like, this is not my fault. Like, why is this happening to me? You would have felt all those emotions, and then like just an overflow of them just made you cry. And it was like, I feel like that's what I see crying as, is I see crying as all the stress and the built up anger and the frustration that you have with certain things, just letting it out. Like, because then after you feel tired and you want to go for a sleep and then you wake up and you're sweet. Like, it's so exhausting to have a big cry.
Yeah.
But, you know, like waking up after it, you're like, yeah, this is actually, I needed that.
Yeah. And it's like, after you cry, sometimes it's like, oh, actually wasn't that bad.
Yeah, yeah.
It feels like that.
Yeah.
Because obviously when you're under pressure and stress, and like there's a lot of emotions flowing through your body and your IQ seems to lower, like everything feels like a lot worse than what it actually is, bro. So,
Yeah.
bro, I can relate. Probably need to cry a bit more, to be fair.